All right. I'm so glad to have on Bad Faith Podcast somehow for the first time Eshna Krishnaswamy. You might know her from historically her Substack, which you should definitely check out. Welcome to the podcast, Esha.
Thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. We were just going through the history of when we actually met in person for the first time when I was traveling on the Bernie campaign and we met in South Carolina. And we haven't seen each other since then, but I've been such a huge fan of yours. I think I recently retweeted a great interview that you had done on, was it macro and cheese?
Oh, yeah, it was a few months ago about Russia and the breakup of the Soviet Union and the whole history.
It was excellent. You're such an amazing storyteller. And then more recently, I was looking at some of your tweets and some of the broader sort of speculation that's been going on about the various methods that may or may not be deployed at the moment to sort of disrupt the left. I mean, you and I both are very familiar with the stereotype of the left and our infighting and our inability to make progress because of sort of self-imposed rules. We recently got into this a little bit with Vincent Bevins when he was on the show, and we were talking about different theories of how leftist socialist organizations should be organized, and whether leaderlessness is ultimately a choice that frustrates left movements as opposed to advances them. But also, it feels like in this particular moment, partly because of the nature of social media, partly because of the nature of what feels like an appetite for some level of conspiracy theory, especially on the left, especially on the right, I should say, the rise of kind of RFK Jr. and the interest of what happened to his family members, COVID and the interest in whether lab leak theory is real and how this pandemic started, that there's a kind of a conspiratorial air about. And I saw you engaging with a little bit of this, talking about whether or not organizations like the CIA have put their finger on the scale in various ways historically. And I thought it was worth talking about now because I saw a sort of viral claim going around that this new pop group that's being branded as a half Palestinian, half Israeli boy band is the latest effort in our government's efforts, or kind of global government's efforts, to disrupt solidarity campaigns that advocate for the rights of discrete groups. What do you make of it all?
Well, it's hard to find out for a fact. I searched the National Endowment for Democracy's website and also the State Department website. That group, I can't remember their name, but I can't find any data that they are actually being funded or supported by either the State Department or the National Endowment for Democracy, which is an organization that started in the 1980s. And they said, like the founder actually said, we do openly what the CIA did clandestinely.
Mm.
But it does follow their MO for the past 70 or 80 years, in that what they want to do is move the conversation away from talking about oppression and oppressor to more abstract levels of peace and freedom and less political conversation. So having a band with 50% Israelis and 50% Palestinians singing will obfuscate the idea that Israel is engaging in an ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza and make it more like both sides kind of thing. And that has definitely been their MO since after the Second World War.
So this group apparently is called As One, but there's also a number one between the words as and one, and is written as one word. So I'm not sure how you're supposed to spell that or what that's supposed to be. But even the name of the group seems to suggest, oh, we're all together, don't worry about it. So actually, you alluded to what the CIA's MO has been, even if we can't say anything for sure about this group as of yet. So you're such an amazing storyteller. Help me understand exactly the kinds of efforts that the government has undertaken to try to use culture to affect our politics.
Not just our, but global. So let's start with after the World War II. The Soviets was obviously spent majority of their energy. 80% of the German troops who were killed by the Soviets. They freed so many countries, and they ended up plunking the red flag in Berlin. And meanwhile, after fighting World War II, many Western European countries who had overseas colonies in Asia and Africa did not have the military power to maintain the amount of oppression needed to maintain these colonial powers. And so slowly, one by one, countries in Asia and Africa that were formerly colonized started being independent. So at this point, the US had an image problem that was pretty well earned. The first one was that they were a neo-colonial power. So there's no difference between them and what England or France did. And of course, their actions in Korea, Vietnam, you name it, Guatemala, whatever, has shown that that is mostly true, that they did seek to basically extract raw materials and not develop these countries, which were underdeveloped because of the hundreds of years of colonialism. So, for example, the country of Zambia, when England left, they had an illiteracy rate of 99%. They didn't have any schools. And so it was the same case with a lot of African and Asian countries where there was a lot of poverty, and the relationship was usually a Western corporation was extracting their minerals, and then they had to buy basically imported manufactured goods, and that always puts them on an uneven playing field. And with that, they'll never get developed, as in build highways, roads, schools, etc., in order to embetter their population. So that was a very well-earned reputation. And the second one had to do with racism. Everyone knows back then and even now that Black Americans are very oppressed in the US. Back then, there was formal systems of segregation. After that, there were systems of redlining, the mass incarceration, etc., in order to keep a class of oppressed people. And so the US had a problem, because if you're going to go talk to African diplomats and say, hey, let us come in and give us these contracts for your minerals, and at home, you have overt segregation where little kids need the National Guard to be escorted to school. That creates a very bad image problem. So because of this, they had a lot of trouble with diplomacy. And so in 1953, the US, well, one more problem, sorry.
No, please.
And then within Western Europe, after World War II, capitalism was very discredited, obviously because, as we know, fascism is basically capitalism on steroids. And so a lot of intellectuals in Western Europe had Marxist leanings, had socialist leanings, and they produced a lot of art that was very critical of the US. So, for example, if you look at Pablo Picasso's War in Korea, it shows the kind of how the US troops in Korea targeted civilians and enact brutality upon the Korean population. And so that was the kind of thing that was going on with the culture. And there was a lot of leftist literature that was very critical of colonialism and imperialism. And so when the conversation is on that playing ground, they can't win because it's true. So they needed to change the conversation. So for that, what they did was, the first thing they did was change the kind of art that they promoted. So instead of having realism or something like cubism with like Picasso, they created abstract art. And what people don't know is the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art has very severe, I'm just looking at my notes, I hope that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, Metropolitan had ties with, has heavy national security ties. For example, in 1929, it was started by Abby Rockefeller, and her son, Nelson Rockefeller, became the president of MoMA. And later, he was appointed by the Roosevelt administration to work in the State Department for Latin American affairs. And then there's another executive secretary between 1948 and 49, Thomas Braden, who later went on to join the CIA. So what they needed to do is, from art, take out the political message and change it to a more apolitical question. So they sponsored over 40 shows all over Western Europe, Latin America, some even Haiti, with abstract artists like Jackson Pollock and Georgia O'Keeffe, where the conversation shifts from something like I said, I used the Picasso piece from what is the U.S. doing in Korea to is this art? Why is this should be considered art? And that was the first thing. Another thing
So
they did, what?
yeah,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No,
Well,
you
I
go
was just
ahead.
going to ask. I mean, I've heard a version of this, which is, abstract art is an effort to undermine very message-driven political art, including the kind of Rubenesque, kind of Soviet mural style paintings that you see in a lot of like New Deal artwork around the country in old courthouses and mail post office depots and things like that. And I've always been a little curious about the extent to which the argument is that the modern artists themselves, the abstract artists themselves, were complicit, or whether it was the CIA and organizations like the Met expressing a preference for abstract art that basically drove the market for artists to make more of that type of art, as opposed to the more explicitly political art. Because you allude to obviously this Picasso painting, which is representational, but of course he moves in an abstract direction as well.
Well, no, he was Cubist.
An increasing abstraction away from realism is what I mean. I don't mean literally.
Oh, okay.
But go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. Well, we don't never know what the artists were doing, but what we do know is in 1949, the State Department spent a lot of money and thousands of dollars purchasing artwork from various abstract artists. And they used that to have tours around the world in order to showcase this. So we'll never know what was in the heart of the artist. And maybe they did or did not know because the State Department and also later the CIA operated under many umbrella organizations like the Congress for Cultural Freedom and so on. And the funding sources were opaque. So a lot of artists probably were in good faith and did not know that they were being directly funded by the US national security agencies. But but we do have records of the US national security agencies funding certain kinds of art because it helped them further their political message or their diplomatic message. So that is
So
what
it's
we can
not
see.
Kandinsky's an op. It's
What?
maybe this is just what the kind of what was being driven by cultural tastes because of people who are working behind the scenes. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we will never know what's in the heart. So we can only look at what we have evidence for.
Sure. Okay. So I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Okay. So then, the second thing they did was, so the Cord Mayor was one of the leads in the CIA, and he was worried about what he called the old left, people who would talk about class politics and talk about the class warfare, etc., and overthrowing the bourgeoisie. What they wanted was to create a kind of compatible left who would talk about some cultural issues, social issues, more identity politics, and less driven about class warfare. So they sponsored many leftist magazines to create this what they call the compatible left. For example, in England, they sponsored in England they sponsored the magazine Encounter. In the French language, they sponsored Previews. And it also changed the conversation from talking about concrete oppression, as in you work for 12 hours a day and make whatever francs an hour, to ideas that are more vague, like freedom and democracy, which can be molded into meaning anything that anyone wants it to mean. So that was the second way. And then in the third way, it was also a weapon against the most brutal charge against the US was the unbridled racism. So I could give you this story where there were these two Ghanaian diplomats in the 1950s who were traveling in this highway between New York and Washington, D.C. And somewhere around Delaware, they stopped at this Denny's, and this Denny's was segregated, and they were not allowed in the white section, but they were relegated into the African American or Black section. And this created such an international embarrassing incident that President Eisenhower and Nixon and Vice President Nixon had to come out and apologize. And in fact, they responded to it by literally desegregating that highway from New York to Washington, D.C., where diplomats traveled. And And so that was a very serious charge. So they, again, without having to actually address racial discrimination and racial oppression in the U.S., they wanted to create an impression that the U.S. was racially a more egalitarian place. And jazz music was perfect for it because classical music, no matter what, people didn't view it as a truly American art form or an American creation because it wasn't. It had a lot of European roots. But with jazz music, it was created in New Orleans. It came from the tradition of blues music, and it was fast-paced, rhythmic, and it had a lot of beats that were what one can consider uniquely American. And the second thing was that majority of the jazz musicians were Black Americans, and they could show their success as kind of a way to fight back against extreme charges of extreme racism without having to address it. So they ended up creating an organization called the United States. Hold on one second. United States Agency for Information Services. And they started, which brought all the U.S. propaganda outlets under its umbrella, like the Voice of America Radio, etc. And they started playing jazz music. And then the State Department created a kind of jazz ambassador program, which recruited artists like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong. And they sponsored tours around the world, especially in Africa. And what's very interesting is that after being sponsored by the State Department, these artists did mute their message. For example, in 1957, Louis Armstrong was a very fierce critique of the Eisenhower administration and how they handled the Little Rock school events. In fact, he refused to appear with the president for how he handled it. But then in 1960, he started touring in Congo and Nigeria. When asked about race relations in the US abroad, he said, "I don't know anything about it. I'm just a trumpet player."
That's outrageous and has so many kind of direct parallels to the sort of thing we see today. And I don't mean to jump ahead if you're sort of getting to that. But what comes to mind first and foremost is one, whether purposeful or not, the effect of Obama doing these like top playlists of the year that he puts out or top novels of the year that he puts out that have an incredible effect on the sort of album sales and popularity and notoriety of the artists that end up getting put on the list. And of course, then there's a negative pressure to actually be critical of the Obama, the Democratic Party, or the government more broadly. And we have seen instances of very, very recently with respect to Chapel Roan, where there's been some question of whether or not, why is it that she, who was like arguably the artist of the summer, didn't make an appearance on Obama's latest, top song list, or someone like Charlie XKX, who came out saying that Kamala was brat, and does it have to do with her kind of longstanding critique of the siege on Gaza, of the genocide in Gaza?
I mean, there's always that. And with Obama, it's less of an organized effort and more of this is what he likes because it politically aligns with him kind of thing. But there's also more of an organized effort within the State Department to continue supporting certain artists. So about 4 years ago, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is heavily funded through Congress by the U.S. government, supported this Cuban rap group because they wanted to kind of use that to undermine the Cuban government and create kind of like a color revolution type of situation. So there's and you're right about Rowan. And she, the other day, she said she would vote for Harris, but not endorse her. And the backlash she's faced for such a mealy-mouthed, such a mild critique is ridiculous. But I think it does have a chilling effect on a lot of artists who would be more flamboyant in their critique if they didn't face the same kind of backlash.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should also mention there's some discourse around what it means for a certain artist to head the Super Bowl. I remember years ago, I think it was like 2016 when Beyonce did it. She had this album out with the song Formation, where a lot of the iconography was very sort of like Black Panther coded. And there was this talk about whether or not it was too edgy for the Super Bowl for her to have those dancers there. But truly, the willingness of the Super Bowl to invite you to do the halftime show is evidence. I would say pretty confidently that you're not going to say anything that revolutionary. And if you had something planned, it's off the table as soon as a carrot like that is dangled in front of you. And also, who was it this year? Kendrick, uh, who was, obviously top of mind because of his like year-long feud with Drake. But there's this question of, oh, is Kendrick so radical? He's having a great year. He's going to do the Super Bowl. He's going to do something that's radical and amazing, and yada, yada, yada. But the Super Bowl being one of the most prominent examples of how the government spins to do these jet, airplane flyovers. Everyone stands to greet the flag. I mean, it is a huge investment in American propaganda. And the idea that we would expect anything other than the status quo out of a Super Bowl performance, I think, is very much wishful thinking. And in the couple of instances where artists do transgress, where they're invited into these sorts of spaces like SNL or what have you, and they say what is on their heart, famously Sinead O'Connor, they're never the same again. The Dixie Chicks never. Sorry,
Oh yeah.
the Chicks. Sorry, excuse me. Old habits die hard. Never the same again.
Well, what a lot of people don't realize is that the US military actually spends money with the NFL
Yeah.
through seats. So the NFL's relationship with the US military is very tight, and they do get funding for the Department of Defense. There's also, we actually had a episode a long time ago on historically where we talked about how Hollywood spends a lot of, how the Department of Defense spends a lot of money in Hollywood too, but let's just hold off on that topic for just a second
Sure,
while I
sure.
finish the Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong topic. So with the jazz diplomacy, I'm not sure if it actually had the effect on the hearts and minds of people abroad, but they were, with Louis Armstrong at least, they were able to use his tours in Congo in order to send CIA agents to the region of Katanga. So Katanga is one of the most mineral-rich regions in Congo. Every mineral you could want is there in large quantities. And back then, Congo had President Patrice Lumumba, who was not, he was not a radical socialist. But what he was a social democrat who wanted Congo's resources to be used to develop Congo. And so the US and Belgium alike sponsored the separatist movement in Katanga, and in order to create a civil war where they supported Joseph Mobutu, and eventually it led to the overthrow and the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, and Mobutu was placed in power. And he was more amenable to the interests of these mineral companies to exploit Congo. And it ended up perpetuating the cycle of poverty and misery that still continues till today. So using Louis Armstrong's tour, the CIA was able to actually get access to the region of Katanga in order to grow their assets and recruit assets and militia members in order to effectuate this regime change. Also another thing was that back then Hollywood was not as developed as it is right now. And so Hollywood could not be used for the same purposes as it has been used in the past 40 years for its propaganda efforts. So a lot of movies that you wouldn't even think of, if it uses any kind of military equipment, they definitely have a partnership with the DoD. And in order to get that partnership with the DoD, the movies literally have to submit their scripts. And in fact, the DoD comes back with script notes that says, hey, I don't like this part. Can you change this? And so on. And many movies like Independence Day, even sci-fi movies like Independence Day, Armageddon, often have this kind of DoD collaboration And so they're allowed to use, for example, the Department of Defense's fancy planes, et cetera, to make their movie more realistic. But it comes with the price. It comes with the price of the DoD having a say on the script and them changing it. And like I said, I've done an interview, and there are movies where they have changed the script to make it more milder and less aggressive critiques of U.S. foreign policy. And of course, if you look at the content of a lot of these historical movies, there are many, many movies that talk about the bravery of American soldiers, etc. But how many movies are there, for example, on the El Mozote massacre or My Lai, where U.S. soldiers' actions were horrific and they show the truth about them?
Is the kind of financial influence or support or ability through whatever channels to derail a movie project so significant that you think it's a genuine impediment to doing movies that aren't flattering to the government? I mean, it would seem to me that most, and tell me if I'm wrong, my guess would be that most movies are funded overwhelmingly through backers outside of the government, such that it would be a lot easier to go along if you're doing, let's say, a movie that needs actual props, equipment, airplanes, maybe filming on a base somewhere or something like that, to go along with the government. But if you really were committed to doing a critical film, that, well, I guess what I'm asking is, are there mechanisms to derail projects that aren't even asking for support from the government? But that would be unflattering. Do you know what I mean? Do they have other mechanisms to kind of curb that? And what I have front of mind is the weird kind of plot line that ended up happening in the first Black Panther movie about the CIA tour. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. So this is a very complicated question. So let me answer it. A lot of these movies are movie studios. So, for example, usually they use DoD resources for big blockbusters, like I don't know why, but I'm only thinking about Independence Day, or actually Black Panther 2, or a lot of
Captain
Marvel
America,
movies.
G.I. Joe, I'd imagine.
Yeah, a lot of I mean, a lot of movies that you wouldn't even think about, like Waterworld too sometimes. But what happens is that because these big studios need the U.S. support for certain blockbusters, a more esoteric independent film might not get picked up by the studio because they don't want to ruin their
I
relationship
see.
with DoD.
I see.
So that's
Yeah, that
the
makes a lot of
bigger
sense.
impediment to having movies that are popular or movies that are more esoteric with different critiques is that they're not alone in the ecosystem.
Yeah, that's important. I guess I wanted to ask that question because sometimes we do talk about the influence of money on the left, and the one-to-one doesn't seem like it is always working out, right? Like the amount of money that AIPAC gives to an individual congressional candidate is at times enough to make or break the election. It's frequently enough to make or break the election. But when we're talking about national politics, the amount that are given to presidents, and as we're sitting here asking ourselves, why on earth is Kamala willing to risk an entire election just to send more bombs to Israel, then I think it requires us to complicate the relationships here and complicate the incentive structure. And I think pointing out that, yes, in a studio system, even if a particular film could be made on a lower budget and have relative financial independence, that there still might be reasons why the studio itself might not let the film get made.
Exactly. And that's what I've noticed a lot with movies that want to be more critical of US foreign policy, et cetera, is that they're often great independent films that you can see at Sundance, but they're not going to get picked up by the bigger distributors that you need for national salience.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right about it. It works a lot like money in politics, in that in order for somebody to raise to the level of president, that's not their first election. They are starting at DA, maybe senator. And in those elections, they kind of get natural self-selected for their fealty. And often when IPAC runs attack ads, they don't often run attack ads on the Israel issue. They might run it on a candidate's stance on gun control or their stance on abortion. And the Israel is ancillary, and IPAC is doing it because of their stance for Israel. But the actual ad and the actual attack that they run are often very local issues that are salient within the population.
Yeah, and that's what happened with Nina Turner and her, I think, second race in particular, where the argument was that she was anti-Democrat because she had voted against the party platform because it was insufficiently progressive. It didn't have, I think, a $15 minimum wage as a part of it. And they framed the ad as Nina Turner's against the Democratic Party, and even strongly implied that she was to the right of the Democratic Party, and that if you're a real Democrat, you wouldn't want her around, when, of course, the opposite was true.
Oh yeah, that happens. And like I said, I do remember a candidate. I can't remember his name, but it was in one of the eastern states where they literally ran on his stance on gun control, and it was because of his vote on Israel.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So this what really brought me around to wanting to talk to you was, after seeing some of your tweets, I went over to Historically, and I saw that you had done an interview with Chuck D, who apparently had been a part of one of these government programs to get artists to travel around the world. And as someone who, through his music, is known to have a sort of consciousness, you sort of gently pushed, I thought very tactfully, frankly, at whether he had interrogated the incentives that were funding him and whether or not there was any conflict with his politics. What happened?
Okay, so with Chuck D, everyone knows that he did the Public Enemy #1 and Fight the Power back in the 80s or 90s. And he did have radical politics, and I still think I still wants to believe he has radical politics. But I think right now the State Department is facing the same issue that it faced in the 1950s and 60s. So everyone in the world can see videos of police gunning down predominantly Black youth and not facing any consequences, not even getting a slap on the wrist. And if, like in any other country, they had resorted to that kind of brutality, the U.S. would have. The U.S. would have exploited that issue for the maximum. So, and I think that having this global rappers ambassador program is a way to again show that there are some Black Americans that are advancing within the system without having to change the system. So I think it's a mirror image. And also, it helps remove the revolutionary messaging from a lot of rap music that used to exist all over the world. And I think that with them promoting global rap artists, they will, of course, promote people who, I don't know, rap about their Air Force Ones as opposed to them being oppressed or
as opposed to the U.S. Air Force dropping bombs on parts of the world. Sure.
Yeah, I love Nelly, and it's one of my favorite songs. I just thought about it.
It's funny, actually, because that used to be sort of like, I don't know, a tongue-in-cheek, half kidding, half serious thing that people said all the time, that like they killed Tupac because he was too conscious, that the movie, the record studios and the radio stations are all in cahoots to suppress conscious rap and only allow stuff about gang violence or material goods and drug trade to be on the radio. And it's weird to live in a world where there's little in the way of often of substantive evidence or proof that those things are existing. But that's why I'm so interested in what you're saying about examples from times past where we do have records to demonstrate that this isn't just conjecture, but this has actually been taking place. So I want to ask you, how do we know what we know about the level of influence the CIA has had in affecting our culture?
Not just the CIA. I would say all the national security state, because the CIA sponsored many umbrella organizations. So what we do know in declassified files is organizations that they sponsored and the kind of culture that they advanced with the sponsorship of these organizations. What we can't know is what influence it had. So I can't say that concert overthrew Lumumba or something like that. So what we can say is that the overall messaging after the sponsorship, after the State Department and the CIA and all the umbrella organization, national security agencies started sponsoring, the main kind of art and music that was composed went from being very political to more apolitical. And that was the biggest victory for them, because they can't win when it's political, when they engage in the kind of things the CIA engaged in. For example, with Pinochet, people got thrown out of helicopters. That is indefensible. But if you're not talking about people getting thrown out of helicopters because they opposed Pinochet, and talking about the more abstract idea of, yay, democracy, we get to vote, it's already a victory, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just having this debate on the podcast with Dr. CBS, and I've had it with a lot of different people. I think oftentimes very serious, kind of organization-minded, kind of labor-minded, people with really solid academic backgrounds in kind of left political history, like she has, and African American history, feel this way. And I completely understand it, because what I'm about to say is really unsubstantive. However, I end up in this debate because when I see the level of interest, money, resources that the center, the right, the corporate class invests in affecting culture, arguments from very substantive people on the left that are very dismissive of what it means to have certain kinds of endorsements or cultural tastemakers using their platforms to bring attention to left issues, or to create a permission structure for normies to care about the kinds of things that the left cares about, it makes it difficult for me to ignore that has some value. Now, that's not saying I think we should bank the revolution on Cardi B distracting herself from her current marital troubles and saying, I want to vote for Jill Stein. But it does seem to me that the asymmetry between how much liberals care and invest in bullying Taylor Swift for an endorsement, or bullying Chapel Roan into a more enthusiastic endorsement, or getting Jay-Z into the special partnership with the NFL, and Obama working to make sure the COVID era NBA strike is only a brief dream. They wouldn't put in all that work if those voices didn't matter and those cultural influences didn't matter. What do you make of that argument?
You're 100% right. The hard thing is to quantify how much it matters, but it definitely matters because of how you can see the conversation shifting. And that's the main thing, is that they don't need people to stop all conversation. You can still have people talking about Operation Paperclip, where the US imported thousands of Nazis, war criminals, or you can still talk about how the US tried to do a color revolution in Venezuela. But when you, but when that is relegated to the side, and you are, and the mainstream culture is talking about more apolitical issues, it doesn't even have to be rightward leaning political issues. Just no political issues itself helps the US national security state continue their agenda in maintaining their hegemony. So it matters. And the hardest part is, how exactly does somebody in Chicago or an artist in Louisiana who has no resources, who just paints, how are they going to get enough exposure in order to bring their messaging to the masses? And that is a very uphill struggle that leftists will face, because when you are a leftist, you are obviously going to be supporting people of lower classes who, by definition, don't have that power, don't have the big microphone, are not on speed dial with executives of CBS or Paramount. And so, but because the way the ecosystem works, making sure that these conversations are delegated to the side itself is enough, and they don't need to manipulate the message to be like have patriotic songs 24/7. They just need to change the conversation from leftist politics to no politics.
Yeah, I mean the even transition. Look, I'm not trying to attack the Bayhive and incur their wrath. I don't expect. Again, I don't have expectations of these people. I'm just saying it would be nice if, right? But
Yeah,
watching the trajectory. What were you gonna say?
Yes, it would be great, but it's kind of like in order to get in the position that they are in, they have to cater. In order to rise to that level, often their natural instinct is to cater to that apolitical messaging.
Right. And we went from kind of this like Black Panther cosplay in 2016, which, wasn't substantive, but at least she was talking about a lot of the imagery in, I guess that was Lemonade, was, New Orleans and flood conditions and the indifference of the government to the people of New Orleans. Like there was like some of that in there. I'm like, okay, all right, there's some of that in there. Again, it's easy to criticize a Bush administration as opposed to a Democratic administration, but fine. But now it seemed to some to be a regression where we're now in a world where what's subversive about Beyonce's latest album, quote unquote subversive, is her standing in cowboy gear with an American flag behind her with a white horse. And the idea of kind of appropriate or reappropriating, I maybe should say, country music and Southern iconography as a woman who is from Texas herself is the kind of subversive, transcendent thing. Again, moving into an identity politics realm. And I'm not going to say that that's not, there's a little bit of it there. She didn't get shut out of the CMAs. I'm not saying that there isn't racism and that there aren't biases within the industry and all of those kinds of things. It's perfectly fine for that to be her priority. But it does feel politically, in terms of my politics and broader kind of class politics, like a retrenchment.
I can't disagree with that. And I think that you're right. In the 2016, when she had that album out, there was some political critique. And I also am a little skeptical about her appropriating Black Panther iconography, because I think what they did is basically take out the revolutionary politics, because everyone knows that the original Black Panthers were Marxist-Leninists. And they started the school breakfast program and major literacy programs in areas where they operated, mainly in Oakland, California. And to take that and appropriating their iconography to a more muted liberal kind of politics is actually a very true and tried technique. So I'm a little more skeptical about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say also, I think part of what I find to be frustrating, your point about how, given the nature of our politics, we have very few allies with power or resources, right? And people who are starting out trying to do more revolutionary art have very few opportunities to break through for all the reasons you've described. That's why when someone does seem to have an awakening, or their politics weren't front and center and they were able to get a certain amount of success, and then they have these aha moments, your Macklemores, who I think many people are now feeling like, oh God, I misjudged him for wearing that goofy coat, like, yay, king. Or, your Susan Sarandons, people who have had their careers legitimately imperiled by speaking out. Your Adam McKays, your occasional person in Hollywood who's willing to stand by their commitments, their political commitments. The Jonathan Glazer, who of course got all that incredible backlash after doing a literal Holocaust movie, right? Being a Jewish man doing a Holocaust movie, and getting shouted down for simply saying that that never again means never again for everyone, including Palestinians. Again, the backlash speaks volumes. The I welcome your hatred kind of framing really tells you where the sore spots are. And that is why, I guess, as someone in my position, there's some who say, none of this matters, stop looking for these endorsements. But as someone in my position who sees themselves as somewhere in the middle, right? Like, I'm not starting a brand new podcast and, I have more than, $50 in the bank account. I'm not struggling in that way. But it's not the same for me as for Adam McKay to stick his neck out, right? I'm not Susan Sarandon. I don't have millions of dollars, all of those kinds of things. So I really do value how much more cultural reach and how much more they have to loot, like how much, they can withstand the slings and arrows. When people do stick their necks out, when people say, well, it doesn't really matter when they do it, I'm thinking, it sure as hell does matter, because the more they do it, the less it falls on me. And the more I do it, the less it falls on somebody else who has many fewer resources than me to be the one that's the squeaky wheel.
I mean, it is a very powerful, when somebody with a big platform, like Vanessa Redgrave, it was way back
Yes.
in the 70s. She
Yes.
actually, in her Oscar speech, she actually talked about the Palestinian issue. And back then, Israel was supporting this horrific war in Lebanon, where thousands of Palestinians were getting massacred. It feels like things progress,
Yeah, the
but
more
stay the same.
things, plus ça change. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so it does matter when they do it, and so if it didn't matter, they wouldn't face the same kind of backlash.
Yeah.
But what is lacking is any kind of organized group or organization to push it into the long-term culture. So I will never say it doesn't matter, because it does matter, and it would be nice if more celebrities were to risk their careers. I mean, Colin Kaepernick is great example.
Yes, of course.
He was one of the best quarterbackers, but after he stood up for Black Lives Matter, he couldn't even get re-signed, and his career was torpedoed. And so I think having their career torpedoed creates a negative incentive for future artists. I think a lot of people on the socialist left and liberals understand the power of culture, but the socialist left do unnecessarily dismiss
what is
culture
that?
wars.
Like, what is that about?
I'm sorry, can you repeat what you said?
What is that about, you think? You think they're just worried that we're going to forget about class politics, that we're going to get absorbed by it?
I think that they don't see culture issues as important. It's a very good question. And I think a lot of times they don't understand the effect of cultural issues and how that affects class politics. So for them, I think they don't see that nexus, that sometimes that culture can be used for class-based oppression too.
It seems so obvious, though, when you recount the history that you just spent, the first part of this podcast recounting. I don't know. It just people listeners to this podcast will know that I've been having some version of this of this conversation with guests like every couple months or so for 4 years now, and it never it's not just like let every flower bloom kind of an attitude toward this. It's like kind of an antagonism that bristles up if you even suggest that I should be even a little bit happy that Cardi ever said vote for Daddy Bernie bitch or whatever. like that was like a move in the right direction, or like that's some evidence that our messaging and our consciousness is seeping through. And when Cardi B was doing all those interviews for like GQ magazine or whatever about how much she loves FDR, I mean, caveat all the things about FDR we all know, but like how she's like a presidential history buff, and how hard it was for her to live and earn a wage living in the Bronx up until her relatively recent fame, and how much she values the social safety net because of all of that. Like that was huge. That was huge crossover, huge opportunity. And even working on the Bernie campaign, there did seem to be like a reluctance and an unwillingness, almost an embarrassment about using the significant number of pop girlies who were on our team to the campaign's advantage. I mean, people don't even know. My friends get so tired of me because I'm always like, oh, that person was a Bernie bro. Oh, that was a Bernie broad. As we're like listening to music and watching TV. Because I'm like, yeah, Emily Ratajkowski and Dua Lipa. Every time there's a Dua Lipa song, people can't stand me. I'm like, oh, yeah, she's got good politics.
I sometimes do that too. So it's sometimes really nice to see people that you like in terms of their art and artistry also have good politics. And to me, it's always very interesting. So yes, it does have an effect, but I think a lot of this has to do with the left's powerlessness. They can't create the same kind of media storm that the right has created with trans bathrooms, for example,
Mm.
or whatever. And I think that the powerlessness of being able to create mass art, that can push into the mainstream culture makes them naturally dismissive. So where the left can succeed, I think a lot of times right now is with unions or with concrete issues like raise the minimum wage. But I think so. I wonder if that's what causes a lot of socialist leftists to dismiss the idea of culture war. But clearly, if the State Department is spending millions of dollars on something, it has to matter.
By the way, you said something a little bit earlier as well that I think is an important point. Um, you said something about whether or not, whether or not part of the issue is being able to siphon the interest that comes from a pop icon or some kind of famous figure endorsing our politics into a longer term movement or organization. And I wondered if you could unpack that a little bit, because that's been some of my feeling as well. How to capture the energy, whether it's from the Bernie campaigns or from the disgust with the bipartisan endorsement of genocide in Gaza or whatever it is, into a movement that has a more fixed ideology and also is fixed in terms of its longevity between campaign cycles. And that's part of why I'm interested in investing in the Green Party as a political party that can be a touchstone for people like Chapel Roan, who are like, I don't know how to put into words exactly the fact that I don't want to be a part of either of these parties, but I guess I'll vote for Kamala, but I don't like it. Or someone who years ago, like what was this? Chance the Rapper, who got into a lot of trouble for saying something very similar back in 2016. I think I wrote a defense of him in like Rolling Stone magazine at the time, because the mainstream media wants to railroad those people into being Trumpers, saying, oh, you're just another black man for Trump, because there's not a landing pad for them to rest on. There's no place for them to go ideologically or politically.
I mean, I think a lot of that has to do with the Cold War and the past 70 years, where the US government internally has dismantled any kind of organization that has been able to create a sustained effort. The Black Panthers, they've defanged the unions, et cetera, et cetera. So, so I think that is why there's no place landing pad. But what happens is that we'll see something like a celebrity ends up coming out with a radical position, or maybe not even radical, but something that the mainstream culture is opposed to, and they say something. So what happens is that there's a big stream around them for a few weeks, and then basically they get blacklisted, and then the issue gets dropped. And it's because there is no mass organization, no kind of labor union. So for example, with apartheid South Africa, Louisiana dock workers actually refused to load weapons onto the boats. And when the dock workers refuse to do that, you just can't send weapons. But of course, Ronald Reagan helped, and every president after Ronald Reagan helped make unions less powerful than it was in the 1970s, et cetera. So I think that part, and I think the fact that we have a gig economy makes it much harder to unionize. So I actually have a theory that we need to create a union for unemployed people or gig workers, where they can engage in direct action. So I think a lot of it is having not just worrying about elections, because there is a limit with regards to money in politics and ballot access as to how successful organizations get with elections. So I think there needs to be more political organizations that can engage in more direct action of like withholding their labor. So yesterday I was reading.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Oh, yesterday I was reading this declassified document from Margaret Thatcher, where she looked at how long a country can survive if different kinds of service workers went on strike. And apparently the country can survive 0 weeks when garbage workers go on strike.
Well, the French learned that, didn't they?
Yep, and Italians too.
I mean, I'm fascinated by this idea, especially of how it works. I don't know how much you know about this, but the The gig union I sort of get, but I would love to hear more about that as well. But the union, the unemployed union, does seem to be sort of antithetical to the way that unions operate and the way they're able to flex power. So how would that work?
Well, in the 1930s, the US had that. So there were these unemployment councils in almost every city, and they would block traffic, engaging things, and they demanded things like milk for kids. And so in the 1930s, a lot of the new deals came because of these unemployment councils would literally block politicians, say, hey, make sure all the kids in our town get milk. And they ended up succeeding. So it's something that has been done in the past. It's just that the powers that be have let us forget about it in history.
So it's not, or we'll stop our labor, it's, or we'll stop traffic, maybe withhold, or I don't know if voting was an aspect of it, but something outside of obviously using their labor resources as a cudgel.
Yeah, they would have sit-ins. They would sit outside the mayor's house, etc. And so this was very popular during the Depression, and they did get many tangible results for people who were struggling during the Great Depression.
That's so interesting. And I can't help but be thinking simultaneously about the ratcheting up of criminal penalties for people who do engage in protest action, civil disobedience, et cetera. There was just this story out today about the young people who threw soup at those paintings in the museum. I think they were like, what, a Van Gogh? I think they were in the UK. One of them got, I think, 2 years.
Oh, at Balfour's painting?
Yeah, let me pull up what this actually was.
No, I thought they threw the painting of Lord Balfour, who ended up.
Oh, no, not that one. This was even less than that, because that one they actually damaged, right? These museum paintings were behind glass. There was absolutely no damage to the painting.
Okay.
Here, let me. Okay. Phoebe and Anna, the two who engaged in this action, have just been sentenced to 2 years and 20 months in prison, respectively, after throwing soup on the glass frame of Van Gogh's sunflowers. Like 2 years and like a year and a half in prison for throwing syrup on a painting that was behind glass and received no damage. So I'm looking at that. I'm obviously looking at cop cities. I'm looking at the Cornell student that they're trying to deport for participating in a protest. I'm looking at the first tenured professor that was just fired, the Jewish professor Finkelstein. I'm looking at all of this, and I'm looking at this example of people who are willing to obstruct traffic or engage in civil disobedience. And it feels to me like the state is like 3 steps ahead, that they've realized that they have closed off opportunities for people to agitate for themselves politically, and that the natural outlet for that is going to be protest and civil disobedience. And they have been on the ball in making it harder and harder to protest, act out, or speak, exercise your First Amendment, do anything, until we're so constrained that we're completely submissive.
Yes and no. In the 1930s, they would actually could mass arrest people for vagrancy, and that's just being in a public place. So the state was always this brutal. I think right now we know more about it because of all the information. And it is to be expected because people in power want to keep status quo. So any kind of change in status quo is seen as a threat to national security. And so, yes, they have ratcheted up the penalties for just being Palestinian. The Michigan Attorney General has charged some University of Michigan students for having peaceful encampments with criminal charges that were unprecedented. And recently Cornell said that actually protesting their entanglement with the defense industry is a suspendable offense.
Right.
So it is true that they have been ratcheting it up, but I think they have been ratcheting it up because they're facing more public pressure. So the
chicken of the egg of it all is, not as important to me as what we do about it. Because it does feel like, again, I just had this conversation with Dr. CBS, and we're both kind of alluding to the reality of armed struggle as a a feature of resistance movements in the past, but we're sitting here looking at the most powerful army in the world, a legal system, a criminal system that is rigged to the max, where we had just a painful week of multiple death row state executions of people who even the prosecutor maintained their innocence and the victim's family are maintaining their innocence at the end. I mean, and it does feel like, and for all of the reasons that labor has been neutered over the past 5 decades. I mean, I do wonder, Esha, how you're feeling about this and what avenues for progress seem most optimistic to you, given the constraints that seem so significant.
Well, I think what people need to do is kind of provide people who are going to be target of state persecution with some kind of safety net. Back in the day, unions had strike funds, so people who got fired for striking, their family wouldn't starve. So that's the first step, is having some kind of mutual aid or some kind of organization that makes sure that if people do get retaliated against, they won't be starving on the streets. So that's the first step. And you're right. It is not an easy task, because if it was an easy attainable task, it would have been done long ago. So I think what we do have is that we have the ability to look at what's going on and enlighten people about the oppressions that they're facing in this world much more easily than they could have even like 5 years ago. What is hard is, like I said, organizing any kind of sustained effort aimed at the system. And I think there needs to be a parallel track, one with electoralism, one with direct action, and something in between too, that makes sure that it keeps on being sustained. I think the most dangerous, not dangerous, but the most least threatening is those protests that happen and then just disappear after a day or two, because it is not a sustained direct action.
Yeah, I saw someone, I think, tweeting in response to the news about the Stop Oil protesters who threw the maple syrup, saying that they've been, the state's approach to these kinds of things and the ratcheting up of penalties. That ground zero was moving the encampment at Zuccotti Park, a kind of recognition that the stability of that encampment was a different kind of threat, and a commitment to immobilizing those kind of encampments, or undermining all of those kinds of encampments, as a first order priority going forward from that. And we've certainly seen that example on college campuses around the country, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot more of that playing out as the school year progresses, now that we're in the fall. But I really appreciate you coming here to talk to us today. I love listening to your history breakdowns, and I want you to tell the audience where they can find more of those and more of you on the internet and beyond.
Historically.net, and also my YouTube channel. Recently, I've been doing this documentary series called Myths About the Nazis, because there are so many. I mean, the education about World War II is just painful. The first one is Nazis are socialists.
What's that? I'm sorry.
I said the one that like people love saying, "Are Nazis are socialists?" And they're like, "Nope." If you look at their economic policy, they're like Ronald Reagan on steroids. So I've been doing that series, and I'll continue doing that series. So I'll send you a link to my YouTube channel. Also, go to historically.net, and if you can become a paid subscriber, I would really appreciate that.
Amazing. You definitely should. And go there to watch the full Chuck D interview as well. It's fascinating.
Also, next week, I'm going to have a companion piece for this interview out, where I do list out the ways in which the U.S. national security state influences culture. So it's coming out on Monday. So if you could include a link in the description.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, we'll definitely do that. I think this is going to be aired on a little bit of a delay. So we'll definitely be able to pair those things together. Okay. Thank you so much again for joining us. Thank you, as always, for listening to Bad Faith Podcast. Take care of yourselves. And as always, keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.